Right, before we get started, as you might remember back in the middle of December, I had a bit of a conundrum over which seat to fit to the T100. Motone had just released their crate skinny sort of brat style seat and also the Black Mamba skinny. And I really liked both, but I couldn't decide which one to fit, neither could Motone, so we put it to the vote. Now, it was an overwhelming majority, and I have to admit I'm quite glad it was the seat that I was sort of leaning towards as well, was the ribbed crate skinny black. So that's the seat that will be staying with the bike, and the other one will be going back to Motone. Now, brakes. I remember back in the early 1980s reading a review in one of the big bike magazines. I can't remember which one it was. And as often happens, the journalist was gushing over this particular bike that he was testing, as they do. And when it came onto the subject of the front brakes, he got really excited about the fact that he was able to stop this bike effectively just by using two fingers. Now, I don't think it was his intention, but by the end of that decade, this two-fingered braking became the standard by which all front braking systems were judged on motorbikes, and I think it's really silly, to be quite honest. It doesn't matter how many fingers it takes to actuate your front brake, as long as it stops the bike effectively. And under hard braking, you don't need your two additional fingers to grip onto the hand grip, because all your weight's been pushed forward and is on your palms. After all, we don't judge car braking systems by how many toes that you need to stop it. Now, to that end, a lot of bikes like the Bonneville have suffered a lot of criticism over the braking systems. But I personally think that the brakes on the T100 are pretty good. It is, after all, a roadster, not a 150 horsepower racing machine. And in my view, the brakes are more than adequate. But we're modifying and customising this bike, so the brakes are going to get a makeover. Now, I don't propose to go through a blow-by-blow account of how to remove your front wheel. We've done it before in this series, and if you can't remember, I suggest you go back and watch all of my videos again. Also, I've referred to the Haynes service and repair manual throughout this video, especially for the torque values, etc. So once again, if you don't have one of those, I strongly suggest you get one. It'll be the best 20 quid you've ever spent. So obviously the first thing you need to do is get your front wheel up off the ground and remove it, as per my previous video or your Haynes manual, or both. Now, as you remove it, pay special attention to where all your spacers and washers go. Don't thread the axle back into the wheel because it'll get in the way, but thread your spacers and washers, etc. back onto the axle and put it to one side. Now, what we've chosen to do for the brake upgrades is replace the brake discs with a higher quality, higher performance item from EBC, along with a pair of their HH sintered pads. Now, Triumph state that the brake hoses on this bike should have been changed at 4 years of age. It's now 8 years old, and I'm pretty certain that the brake hoses are the originals, so they're well overdue. I'll have to change the brake fluid when I replace the hoses anyway, but once again, I believe that's probably well past the 2 years replacement interval. And just those two items alone can make a big difference to the performance of your brakes. Now, doing the front and rear and the hoses all in one video is just going to be too much for people to digest, and the video is going to way overrun. So I'm going to split this up into 3, maybe 4 different videos. We're going to do the disc and pad changeover for the front end in this video. In the next video, it's going to be the rear, and then after that we'll go on to a video about changing the brake hoses. I'm just breaking it down into small digestible chunks. Now, for the discs, we've chosen the EBC XC discs, and in both cases they're the contoured discs, and I chose them because I thought they looked prettier. The front is a fully floating disc. The disc itself is 100% stainless steel with a lightweight alloy centre. And to accompany that, we've gone for the double H sintered pads, a well-known and respected pad that in conjunction with this disc will provide excellent stopping power with a good progressive feel, taking the braking up to a substantially higher level than the originals. Now, the first thing you need to do is get your wheel onto a flat surface. I used my new bench from Tufferman's, and loosen off the 6 bolts that hold the disc onto the wheel. Now, this is probably the most difficult part of this entire job, because as usual, Triumph have used gallons of Loctite Just take your time and work your way around it gradually. You don't want to be damaging any of these nuts with carelessness, because we are going to reuse them. They are very tight, and once you've got them off, we're going to need to clean off all that excess Loctite out of the threads, both on the bolts and on the hub itself. So you'll need a reasonable quality tap and die set. It's an M8 thread, and just gradually and carefully go through the process of cleaning those threads out. If you don't, in all likelihood you will end up stripping something when you're trying to put your new disc on. So it is just worth that bit of extra effort here to get them all clean before you go ahead with the disc fitting. Right, once you've done that, screw all your bolts back in finger tight just to check for operation, make sure that they're all as they should be and that they've been cleaned up properly. I know it's been suggested that these bolts are single use only and that you should replace them. I disagree with that. These are high tensile bolts which screw into a soft alloy hub. So the first of these components to fill is undoubtedly going to be the hub, not the bolts. Now Triumph recommend this because they know that they're going to be covered in excess Loctite and that trying to reuse them without cleaning them is going to be fraught with problems. Providing you've cleaned them properly and carefully and that there's no visible corrosion, it's going to be perfectly okay to reuse these. Now the next thing to do is to put your new disc right way up onto your hub. That means with the inlets for the bolt heads facing upwards, and line up the holes with the threads. Then put a liberal amount of medium strength Loctite on each bolt and insert it into its respective thread. Screw them in until the thread stops, but don't tighten them up yet. And once they're all in place, it's time to get your torque wrench out and set it for 22 Newton meters. Now these should be tightened up in an opposite star rotation. So tighten your first bolt up, then go to the bolt on the opposite side of the hub, tighten that up and work your way around using that method. When you've finished, go around very carefully with your torque wrench just to ensure that they've all remained at the same torque setting, because sometimes when you fasten any sort of plate or cover down like this, you may find that the pressure has been released on some of the earlier bolts that you've fastened up and that they're not at the correct torque setting. When you've done that, I would recommend just doing a bit of housekeeping on your hubs, clean out any old dirty grease and replace it with some fresh high performance grease that's suitable for bearings. There's no need to repack the bearings, just clean up the visible accessible areas and get plenty of fresh grease in there, because its main function here is to keep the elements away from the actual bearings themselves. When you've done that, it's time to put the wheel back on. Now, using your torque wrench, your axle nut should be fastened up to 60 Newton meters and your axle clamp bolt should be tightened up to 27 Newton meters. Well, please bear in mind that some of these torque settings vary depending on the model of Bonneville that you own. So once again, it is best to have a Haynes manual on hand to get the specific torque settings for the model of Bonneville that you have. And now we've got that out of the way, it's time to clean the brake caliper and fit the new pads. Now changing the pads is actually a really simple job, it just takes a couple of minutes. The first thing you need to do is unscrew this metal dust cap near the bottom of the caliper. When you've removed this gives access to an Allen screw inside, and this is actually the slider pin that holds the brake pads in place. Carefully unscrew it and withdraw it, and as you withdraw it, keep an eye on what's going on inside the caliper. Now the pads will almost literally just fall out because there's nothing else holding them in. But also there's a little spring tension clip underneath them which might also fall out at the same time. You need to be aware of that, and if you have to replace it, you need to make sure that you put it back in the right way up. Now this is basically the only time that you get to inspect and check your caliper and make sure that everything is all as it should be. I last cleaned this caliper about a year ago when I changed the fork oil and springs, so I know it's not going to be in a state. Now you're going to need to push the pistons in to put your new pads in, but before you do that you need to give all of it, including the pistons, a really good clean to get rid of any grime, check for corrosion and check for any damage that might be causing problems or may cause problems later on. Now just over a year ago I started using a Silcoline product which is a combined brake and chain cleaner. It's safe on all O-ring chains and it is an okay chain cleaner, but where it really excels or shines is that it's the best brake cleaner I've ever used. Now I don't know what's in this stuff, but it's probably not good for you to breathe it in, so make sure you use it in a well ventilated area and take steps not to breathe in any fumes from it. Now I gave it a good going over with this stuff before fitting the new pads and it came up like new. Now this cleaner uses a high pressure nozzle, so it's really effective at loosening and blowing away any dirt, even in inaccessible areas. It almost completely takes away the need to use any kind of brush to agitate, and I think using this stuff long term will substantially reduce the need to strip your calipers down. I am really impressed with it. Now once you've cleaned everything off and you've allowed it to dry, push your calipers all the way in. You should be able to do this with your fingers. If not, the Haynes manual does give various suggestions on what might be wrong or how to tackle it. Mine went in just fine, and this is basically to give yourself some room because your new pads are going to be fatter than your old pads and you're going to need that space to be able to get the new pads over your disc while you're refitting your caliper. The pads actually slot in really easy, just pay attention to what you're doing and make sure that they do go in properly. There's a little aperture at the back that they hook into, and then it's just a matter of holding them in place with your fingers while you slide that pin in and then screw it up tight. Now before putting your pads in, of course, put a little bit of copper grease on the back of the pads and smear it on. You only need a really thin smear of this. It doesn't want to be dripping in the stuff, just a very thin smear. Also put some copper grease on your pin before you put it in and on that dust cap. This is just to make sure that nothing seizes up before your next service. Now if you've pushed your pistons all the way in, it should just slide back on over your new disc with ease. If not, you may just have to have another go at it and just see if you can get it back a little bit further. It's then time to reinsert the caliper bolts and start fastening it back on. Now the brake caliper mounting bolts should be fastened up to 28 Newton meters, and don't forget to replace that dust cap for the mounting pin. Now before you go any further, use some more of that brake cleaner to give the disc a good thorough clean. You've been handling it with greasy hands and you don't want any of that grease contaminating your pads. Likewise, when you're fitting these pads, take great care not to contaminate them with any of the slippery materials that you're using. Now as far as this part of the installation goes, we are now finished. You will need to pump the brake lever a few times to extend those pistons so that your pads are actually in contact with the disc. Usually 2 or 3 pumps is all that's required. Check the brakes for operation, make sure that they engage properly and that they back off from the disc properly and that they're not binding. Then take the bike for a short, low speed run to ensure that the brake is operating correctly. Right, that's about it for this video. In the next video we'll be doing more or less the same to the rear braking system, with the slight difference that we will be using the Motone remounting kit to move the caliper up away from underneath the swing arm where it gets the worst of the weather at it. Once again, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you found it useful. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll leave a link for all the materials that I've used in this video if I can find links for them, and I will of course be back on Friday. So until then, please ride safely and I will see you soon.